firefighter registry. Keith started with a bachelor's in psychology from Truman State University, where he got into heavy stats, and then proceeded there to get an MBA at Washington University in St. Louis. Got into executive leadership, and then more stats, again at a fairly technical level. He's going to talk to us this morning how industry and impact affects algorithm fairness strategy. And he has examples how fairness strategy changes based on the type of problem that you're trying to solve, with examples from healthcare and credit and marketing. And I think these practical applications of algorithms are really of very much interest to this group, because while we work in a fairly rarefied atmosphere, we're always interested in how the work that we do really impacts the lives of workers, and we want to make sure that what we're doing and the algorithms that we use don't have any kind of biases that we're not aware of. And so this kind of seminar really speaks to a lot of the interests that I think this group has. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Keith. I'm going to mute myself, and I would ask that others do as well. If you want to put questions, I guess we have a chat. We can put that in, or preferably try to hold questions unless they're just for clarification purposes. Try and hold your questions until the end, and then we can have a lively discussion. So without further ado, Keith, take it away.
All right, so thanks for kind of joining me here today, and this is going to be a more of a philosophical discussion around some of these topics. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical implementation details, but maybe at a later date I can help out with that, or if somebody's interested, I could go into more detail around some of these things. But a little bit about my background. I think he already covered some of it, but I'll kind of dig into my career highlights just so I can establish some sort of credibility here. Currently program manager at NIOSH. What attracted me obviously was the mission statement for NIOSH and the service, in general. Senior director of data scientific services at Cigna Health. I ran a very large organization around data services, which had business intelligence, data science, data management, data integration, basically everything data fell underneath me, and we were responsible for all the clinical trial work, data collection, integrity, quality, all of the analysis and associated with all that. Not the final analysis on the trials, but everything related to data integrity and quality we kind of owned. And we did a lot of psych trials, a lot of cancer, a lot of cardiology. The biggest thing were probably the vaccine trials. So we did all the Pfizer COVID vaccine trials. Is probably the biggest claim to fame there. And then, so that was my healthcare stats background. I also worked in mental health back in my early set of my career. So that's kind of how I got into healthcare and learned some of that stuff initially. VP of Treasury Trade Services at Citigroup. That's where my financial services background came from and how I was involved with, some of the banking algorithm stuff. And then St. Louis Integration is my private consulting practice where I've helped out a number of different organizations. I just listed some of them here around architecture, system design, implementation, strategy. And some of those involved a lot of like marketing statistics and segmentation and analysis, those kinds of things. So particularly for like NRG, that was a big deal over there, identifying customer lifetime value type activities. All right, personal interest. Only reason I'm bringing this up because this is kind of a philosophical topic, and fairness is a particularly important topic to me because of some of the social justice work that I've been involved with in the past with like some nonprofits, Volunteer Executive Council and Unitarian Universalists, like social justice organizations. And the thing that I've found is that they have a very specific perspective on what fairness means to them or means for the groups that they're trying to advocate for. but they oftentimes don't take the perspectives of some of the other groups involved in some of these things. And so I thought that was relevant to provide that context for this general conversation here. So what am I usually doing for these people? Service and product design, organizational design, data asset assessment, algorithm development and direction, data science and process. If I put these two charts on there because these are probably my two biggest learning tools that I use when I'm working with a data science organization or statisticians to help them understand the things that are outside of their specific purview associated with statistical algorithm development. So there's obviously all of these dependencies that are oftentimes taken for granted by the scientists. And this kind of helps provide some additional context. So that's usually what I'm doing is that kind of stuff. How this hit my radar here. So I have obviously my background, but all that's kind of basically on LinkedIn. And so there was a graduate student who was doing some research out of, I want to say Denmark. And he sent me a survey related to this topic. And, he just happened to hit the exact backgrounds that I have to kind of make commentary on how these things differ from each other. And in the course of having this conversation with this guy, helped me figure out I know a lot about this stuff that a lot of people do not, evidently. And so I recorded that conversation. That's available online on YouTube. If anybody ever wants to Google and look it up, but that's a pretty good conversation. It was a very organic back and forth with that guy. And a lot of the assumptions that he had about some of these topics were just completely off. And providing him some of these additional perspectives really helped him with the development of his paper. I think he's publishing sometime this year, part of his doctorate. Okay. So scenarios he kind of presented to me. CEO attempting to be fair in hiring practices. So obviously there's a lot of, I also want to, one more point I want to make. There's a lot of political context to some of these things that, there's political influence and there's political philosophy and perspective on this. And a lot of what you have to do as a scientist and as an algorithm developer is try to set your personal opinions and whatever the agenda is for some of these things are aside while you do the analysis and while you come up with this strategy. And just throwing that out there. So first context, first scenario was a CEO attempting to do fair hiring practices, and what that means to different groups and what that means to a business. The healthcare scenario algorithm, which was probably something most of the people on here are familiar with, which is the patient diagnosis and treatment development. What is fair for a treatment plan when you include things like race and region and other IDs like that. Financial scenario, the biggest thing in there was a credit score calculation and how it's determined who gets what loans. That's another part of that. And then there's the marketing scenario around who gets what products presented to them and how that's picked. So everybody should be familiar with this chart if you've done any sort of, predictive analysis, true positive, false negative, false positives and true negatives. And the idea mathematically on these from the perspective of the graduate student, and he had a very technical math approach to it, was to minimize or equally distribute these across, the different demographic groups was his kind of approach to this. And most of the approaches he kind of had were mathematical in nature. And I'll get into later why that's not always that important, believe it or not. All right. Individual, so the participants in these kind of fairness algorithms and the people that are impacted by these decisions and how these things are developed usually fall into one of these kind of categories. One other thing, if anybody has any comments or questions or they know something more about one of these things that they want to add, feel free to jump in at any time. I'm very interactive and willing to go down a rabbit hole on any of this stuff with people if we have the time. So individual impact by decision outcome of algorithm use. So this is particularly important for things like hiring practices, patients. How much of an impact will this have on the individual that the algorithm is being used to determine. So, prime example, patients. The impact of a healthcare decision can have life and death consequences for the individual involved in that decision-making process. And in those scenarios, it becomes very impactful on how that algorithm is used. So you use everything you have at your disposal in order to make sure that you have the best outcome for the individual, because the stakes for that individual are so high. And for populations as a whole, it may have a lesser impact, even though it does have an impact on them. So cost distribution is an example. So insurance companies are somewhat in different, they're not in alignment from a goals perspective with the individual when it comes to healthcare decisions. Their goal is to minimize cost, maximize profit, and the goals of the individual is to do everything within their power of the organization and at their disposal to make sure that they get the best treatment to provide the best outcome. So because the outcome is so high, and the implementer of the algorithm in this case is the healthcare professional, usually, it tends towards using every bit of data available to them in order to provide the best outcome, regardless of fairness, right? So, and I'll get into more detail on this in the next section, but the biggest thing is to understand the population as a whole, the individual impact, and by population, it can mean several subpopulations. So the insurance industry would be one, the overall society would be another, maybe a demographic group would be a third, a specific demographic group would be a different population. And they all have different goals and objectives when it comes to fairness. And then the implementers of the algorithm, whoever implements it, is also a stakeholder and needs to be taken into consideration when determining the fairness of the algorithm. And usually the implementer of the algorithm is one of these populations that are involved, that have some stake in whatever it is that is being developed. When it's in alignment, it's great for the individual. When it's not in alignment and it's developed for a specific industry or for a specific group, then the individual can sometimes suffer, which is where most advocates for artificial intelligence and algorithm fairness are focused. They're usually focused on the individual. They're not focused on the population as a whole or the population of some subgroup, right? The other thing to remember on all these, not just who the stakeholders are, but algorithms are just tools, right? A hammer isn't a murder weapon unless you use it to kill someone. It's just a hammer. If you misuse it, you misappropriate it, it's going to cause a lot of damage, right? And most of the biases associated with algorithms are introduced from the outside. Math is math. Motivations and incentives for the designer is usually what introduces bias in the algorithms or misrepresented data sets. Our auto classifiers aren't prejudicial unless they're pre-trained to be that way, right? So if you want to be prejudiced in an algorithm, you can introduce the data appropriate to, fixate on that prejudice. Product marketing, self-fulfilling prophecies, these are all like examples of things that can influence bias and kind of cause problems for the algorithm in making them unfair to the individual or to some population. So, impact individual scenario. I kind of touched on this. Medical treatment trials, commonly understood within medical communities and heavily mitigated against. High severity on the individual. Implementer risk is minimal. So pharma and hospitals and insurance companies, their risk on relative comparison to the individual, which is life and death, is relatively low in a lot of these things, which is why some of these what is deemed unfair on a later in a mathematical sense is still the best case scenario for the individual patient. So I'm not sure if I actually had this on a later slide, but I'll talk a little bit about how clinical trials in general try to mitigate fairness in population. So the biggest example that that this folk really wanted to focus on was the disparity between different ethnic groups on clinical trial representation and treatment. And the problem with trying to approach that kind of problem from a mathematical perspective would be to spread out evenly among the different demographics the error rate of diagnosis or misdiagnosis. So essentially, if you have whites and blacks, the fairness algorithm, if approached from a mathematical perspective, would distribute that misdiagnosis equal between whites and blacks. But inherently, because the impact of the individual is so high, that ends up being unfair to the population which you have more information about. So this mathematical strategy on creating a loss function that redistributes error actually ends up being unfair to one population while being not beneficial to the other. And because the stakes are so high on the individual person's perspective, it's life or death. What you find and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, is that in most healthcare clinical trial scenarios, you incorporate all of those demographic informations into your analysis of the data for development of either the health treatment outcome or in the analysis of efficacy of whatever drug is being developed. So what would be considered in other scenarios like financial services where you're legally prohibited from using any sort of like those sort of demographic informational type activities, it's actually a standard practice within healthcare because the stakes are so high for the individual. Now, conversely, those things are also so the strategy has completely changed, right? You can't do it via a mathematical error redistribution methodology because of the impact of the individual. So instead, in order to introduce some fairness, the strategies have to change more to data representation and data gathering. So in clinical trials, they make a huge amount of effort into finding these underserved populations and making sure that they're statistically represented within the experiment to make sure that they're not negatively impacted. Now, there's a lot of historical reasons why different populations don't want to participate in clinical trials or don't want to participate in scientific research in general, which probably everybody on this call is familiar with, and I don't need to go into. But the short version is that history has contributed to and caused bias in representation in treatment and drug trials. So there's a long tail to kind of get past in order to correct for some of that historical bias. Now, that does not mean that for the populations that are very well represented and very carefully studied, that you can say, well, it's not fair to subgroup, whatever, that this majority population is more represented. We're going to not use that information in treatment representation. Nobody would ever even, I think, advocate for that because when people's lives are at stake, you use whatever information you have from family history to genetics to, what they eat that day to, their physical activity records, everything. Just try to save their life. And yeah, it sucks for the other groups, but, the answer is we need more data, right? So the individual impact is so high in healthcare that a lot of these like biases and underrepresentation are essentially put aside for the sake of the individual. And the needs of the population, each individual group population, including the hospital stakeholders who want to minimize costs and maximize profit, and the insurance companies who are stakeholders, but they want to also maximize profit. Their needs are generally put aside for the most part in most countries. Yeah. If you've ever been denied anything by insurance, you know what I'm talking about. It's very frustrating. High impact population scenario. So credit score and lending practices. This ends up being a little bit of a different discussion when you start moving into an industry like financial services. So the individual impact is still relatively impactful, but it's not life and death anymore for financial services. It is inconvenient, unfortunate, it is unfair in some cases, but the stakes associated with the impact to the population as a whole are actually more important than the individual, because it causes economic disparity, it causes businesses to fail or be successful. There are large groups that it actually is much more important to than the individual involved. So what that means is there are all of these regulatory controls when negotiation, first of all, usually it starts with negotiation. And if there's a disparity in how credit lending or financial credit scores are calculated, some groups will try to negotiate representation appropriate for their organization or for their group with the developers of the algorithm and the people that are just this providing this kind of function. So the banks. If there's a huge power disparity, that negotiation will break down and will not work. So banks are trying to maximize profit. They're not in the friend of making business. And so they don't have to negotiate if they don't want to in some cases, and so they choose not to. At that point, that's when the regulatory controls come into place and they put things under enforcement, right? And they say there's a large list. You can actually Google the full list if you want, but you're basically not allowed to discriminate based off of, gender, race, religion, or any proxy thereof, right? So you can't use zip code is one of the things that, strangely enough, for credit scores is not allowed to be used for determining credit score, because it's a proxy for race. If you know what zip code somebody lives in, you have a pretty good idea what ethnic background or what race they have. It can be pretty damning in some cases. So those groups those populations, the banks, credit union lenders, or whatnot, are actually prohibited from using those individual demographic metrics from determining credit score and determining lending practices, which for an individual can be, a good thing, and for a group can be a good thing, but also on an individual basis can be a bad thing, but it's not as negative an impact as it used to be. The other flip side of this too, one of the bizarre situations is that most of the people that advocate for these things do not take the bank itself in as a stakeholder or as a part of the equation when trying to determine fairness. And most commonly, when you talk to social justice groups, or you talk to organizations that are trying to implement some sort of fairness algorithm or make something more fair, they have not considered the service provider, the algorithm developer, as someone who needs to be considered in that equation. So this isn't a direct, I guess it is a direct, but there was legislation. I don't know, I used this example when I was talking to the other guy, but there was some legislation a few years back that wanted to cut lending off. Anything above 20% APR was going to be made illegal, which superficially, if you're thinking about the individual, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, that means that they can get their loan with 20%. No, that's not really how that works. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the interest rate is on a loan. From a banking perspective, it's a measure of risk associated with a group or a population, a demographic set that they're trying to make sure that they still make a profit on that that subpopulation, that segment that they've identified. And so what it means is the higher the APR or whatever the interest rate is, the more risk the bank has identified with the lending practices associated with that group. On an individual basis, it looks predatory and it looks terrible. But when grouped together, if you have 100,000 loans, if they don't have a certain rate of return on a specific demographic, they're just not going to lend to that group. So what that means is that if you have a cutoff, a legal cutoff of how high a credit score, not a credit, a lending rate can be, anybody that falls into a category, a risk category higher than that 20%, will just not be lent to. So what it means is those people are essentially cut off from any sort of lending whatsoever from the financial services institution. So superficially, initially, the reaction is, let's protect these people. from these unfair lending practices. But when you dig into the math and how the actual business function for profitability works for a bank, it actually boils down to this is what they need in order to make sure that they actually make a return on investment on that group. Now, there's been a lot of like back and forth of, well, maybe it should be subsidized for different groups that are higher risk. But at the end of the day, if businesses aren't making money, they don't provide that service. And that was one of those things that like it was like an aha moment for him. He hadn't thought of it from the perspective of the bank. And yeah, so high impact to the bank if something like that would be passed that said 20% is the highest thing that you can provide. That would essentially cut off a market from them. They're not allowed to, they financially can't afford to lend to that organization or that population. And it also dramatically impacts that population because you're essentially cutting them off from any sort of financial services. It's a pretty terrible scenario, actually. And I think that's after that was all explained and walked through with legislators, I think that's why that all got scrapped. So high impact to banks, high impact to individual populations, subpopulations, but impact to the individual actually significantly less in the financial lending practices and credit scores, or believe it or not, compared to healthcare. So algorithm fairness is handled essentially legally and legislatively in the financial services organization. So the third scenario here, marketing information distribution algorithms. This gets into a kind of a moderate impact to individuals, moderate impact to populations and groups, can be high impact to the businesses themselves. And this is kind of in the United States, kind of falls into a buyer beware philosophical attitude towards capitalism and how people have to serve themselves in capitalism. In more controlled economic situations, there becomes much more controls around who can be marketed to what can be marketed to who, and how those are like, implemented. There's minor regulatory controls implemented inside the United States associated with marketing, like, you can't market cigarettes to kids, right? That's kind of a no-brainer, I think, at this point. But that wasn't always the case. And from the perspective of the tobacco companies, pretty massive negative impact. But the overall population and the overall impact of society was even higher, arguably, which is why it got implemented. The negotiations broke down between industry executives and stakeholder groups on that, and eventually legislation came in over the top and mandated it. So marketing is mostly non-regulated. You can market pretty much anything to anyone, and mostly what dictates who you market to and how you market to them is controlled by consumer groups. So, and different groups that represent those various populations. So I used to live in South City, St. Louis, and I lived in West County, St. Louis. And a perfect example of this was when I lived in the affluent West County part of St. Louis, all the ads on the billboards were, mostly like entertainment focused, some concert coming up or some sort of like skincare products or, really, luxury type activities, new Lexus coming out, whatever. I moved to South City, St. Louis, which was much more diverse population. It was like malt liquor ads from Budweiser and cigarette ads, and you get the idea. And it primarily was driven based off of the demographics of that specific area or region. I think most people understand that. And the reason that those algorithms are developed and those specific groups of populations are targeted is primarily driven by customer retention and return on investment of the marketing dollars. And for the most part, the fairness is non-existent. There's little to no discussion or, it just does not play a part in the development of the algorithm designed to target people for marketing and materials. It's purely about the dollar at that point. So this has gotten particularly important online because it's so easy to target a specific demographic. If you have ever used Google Analytics and Google AdSense, you can see specifically what demographic group aged 18 to 24, white males who are straight, who have a college education, and it gets even more refined than that. So you can target a very specific slice of the population for those pop-up ads or those banner ads that you see on websites. And marketing as a result has gotten very, very refined in identifying the target demographic for any given product. And there's little to no regulatory control or concept of fairness in that. It does introduce some additional problems though. So what you find is like education related advertisements online tend to be targeted towards more affluent people, and more like socially impactful, negatively impactful products like, you know, alcohol and smoking tend to be targeted towards minority populations. So there's a lot of like negative connotations associated with how marketing has affected these algorithms have affected marketing within different groups. I don't think, but because we live in a capitalist society and it's a buyer beware attitude towards all of this, for the most part, regulatory controls will probably stay out of effect. In Europe, it's much more strict. They're very controlled over there around marketing. All right, tools to increase fairness. Data representation. I kind of already talked about this to a certain extent. And yeah, the better the data you get, the more representation you have from any given group during any given study, the better the fairness is going to increase, and the more fair it's going to be across those various populations. If all you study is affluent white people, obviously the drugs are going to be tailored to affluent white people. If you'd never have, and you know, my family, I have a mixed race family. So if you don't have people from, you know, the Asian cultures represented in your studies, there's a pretty strong possibility that, you know, those drugs will have adverse effects you hadn't counted on because there are medical differences between different groups. So representation matters. Statistical tools like error minimization and distribution. So this is the one that that the graduate student was very focused on. And the reason he's focused on that is because he was a doctorate student in statistics, and he was looking for a technical solution to what is not just a technical problem, it's also a social problem. It's a, you know, legislative and civil problem. So not taking some of those other things into account, like the politics and the you know, the historical relationships between these different groups into consideration when trying to solve these problems actually doesn't serve you very well. Negotiation, I already kind of talked about this. Usually, if there's some negative impact between two groups, like say the bank and some minority group, they will try to negotiate it out usually first, if there's any sort of goodwill there at all. But when there's a power disparity, negotiations oftentimes will break down and it will not work out. And then it flips to a legislative or a some kind of conflict related resolution. So worst case scenario, civil war, right? But usually not over an algorithm. Additional information. So I've got the original conversation I had with Alejandro is online. If you guys want to see it, it's Googleable. I'll pull it up here so you guys can kind of get an idea where it's at. But it's yeah. I'll share this link and can be distributed later. Race aware algorithms. This is just a link to a paper specifically about how to incorporate race and its impact with various algorithms. Fair lending practices. This is the link to the site that kind of lays out what can and cannot be incorporated into credit score generation and you know, lending rate calculations. And then there's a whole you know, there's a whole swath of um, you know, ethical marketing material papers where people have various opinions and strategies for making sure that marketing is ethical. Um, So yeah, there's a lot of information out there. It's a pretty broad topic. And with that, that's kind of like the high level version. Anybody have any questions or comments or something they want to go into more detail on or?
Let me thank you, Keith. That was, from my perspective as a physical scientist, that was very thought-provoking. Um, uh, I guess I'd like to open it up to questions. If nobody has a pressing one, let me start off with something which is sort of a quasi-Bayesian, if you will, type question. Let me go back to your example of the use of zip code as a proxy for racial identification. So this is an example of correlation. Okay.
Right.
So when you're trying to design a sampling strategy in order to be fair to various subpopulations, you want to design a selection or an inclusion strategy that will give you a representative sample. Okay. Representative meaning you get the numbers add up to give you a population that is statistically what you want. Okay. So as soon as you discover any kind of correlation of any variable with your subpopulation, you need to exclude that variable from your selection strategy. So as you say, in giving loans, you're no longer allowed to use zip code because we have learned that zip code is correlated with racial identification. So zip code goes out as a variable for selection. So when you're trying to design an algorithm which is going to be fair, every time you learn of a correlation, that variable goes out as something which has to influence your selection strategy. So isn't the logical conclusion of all this is that you end up with a statistical study or an algorithm which effectively gives you no correlations in your result and therefore is useless?
Well, that's not, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, you don't want to include redundant like dimensions in your analysis, right? You want to have things that add value. I mean, part of it is fundamentally understanding what you're really trying to do. And the biggest thing I've run into with scientists and even data scientists and statisticians in general is sometimes they don't fundamentally understand that, like even in the clinical trial industry, you're trying to predict the future to a certain extent. That's the whole point, right? And I'll stick with a clinical trial example because oftentimes people think that they're testing the efficacy of a drug. And you are, but more importantly, you're trying to predict the outcome of whatever lever you're pulling and its impact on the future of that group or that population. So when you have correlations between different dimensions in your analysis, really what they're adding is incrementally, there's a diminishing returns on those variables, right? Because you're never going to have a perfect correlation between two dimensions. That's almost completely unheard of. What you want to do is have dimensions that have minimal overlap. And you can do, there's a thing called a primary PCA analysis, which will essentially tell you the overall impact of any given dimension on your ability to predict or classify something effectively. Does that make sense? So when you have, the more something is correlated, the more realistic and more likely it is for you to throw out that additional dimension and say, I don't really need it. It's not really adding much value. And in fact, it can actually add, confusion to the direct line impact. Right. So finding those like correlations when there's incredibly high correlation between two things, then yeah, sure, you can throw it out. But just because they're highly correlated, there still might be, depends on how refined you want your prediction algorithm to be. The way we've done it for volume forecasting in like the utility industry is we usually would do the initial forecast would be based off of historical values, like the time series data of the historical And that would get you 80% of the way there to predicting what the next 3 months would be, right? But then you would incorporate event data, things like introducing introducing a new technology or a massive price change in some other dimension. The price of oil affects the price of electricity. These are other things that are correlated, but actually will add value to this standard forecasting method, this REMA methodology for forecasting. You start layering in these additional dimensions, and so they may be strongly correlated, but if it gets you, another level of accuracy to that future forecast of outcome, then it gives you an extra 2%, maybe a high correlation, but it makes it 2% more accurate. So you incorporate it. Does that make sense?
But yeah, sure. But there you're using as the metric that you're trying to optimize is accuracy, and you're throwing fairness out, okay, at the expense of that. And okay, we do that,
right?
Okay, and I understand that. But I wanted to pursue the point that you were raising, that really when you discover these correlations, you then have to face the music about fairness.
Right. Right. If they're used in some way to like discriminate or misrepresent things, then usually the question of fairness is not considered by the algorithm developers unless they explicitly want to do that. The algorithm development itself is usually based around some optimization or forecasting goal that the developer of the algorithm has in mind when they develop it. A bank does not care about the individual or some subpopulation when they're developing their credit score algorithm. What they care about is maximizing profit for the bank. Now, they're forced to consider fairness in that development because of the societal impact or the impact of the individual. And that's where that secondary step of negotiation and then legislation comes in. And their initial algorithm is based around a loss function, a minimization function that maximizes profit. Their secondary one has to incorporate these legislative requirements of not using race, religion, and those other things, and then any proxies for those. So then they try to, and when they incorporate those additional dimensions into their algorithm, they try to minimize the impact of these constraints that they're given on, again, the primary responsibility and the primary role of that algorithm, which is profit maximization.
I see some hands going up, so why don't you just chime in, unmute yourself.